Hello and welcome to this short documentary about the development and impact of aircraft carriers. This video was made as part of my EPQ course and will go over the development of carriers including their inception and early versions up until the breakout of the Second World War. I will then go on to show the impact of carriers on warfare, so without any further delay, let's move on. To begin with, we need to head back to 1909. This was the year the concept of carriers came about. This was when the US military purchased the first aircraft intended for warfare. Also in 1909, a French inventor by the name of Clement Ader published a book called Military Aviation. In this book, he describes the operation of aviation of the oceans. He describes the plans for aircraft carriers in a different way to the way we develop them now. However, some of the ideas he presents were used for early aircraft carriers and also the ones used in World War II. Some of these ideas include the back of the aircraft carrier being clear of any obstacles. However, he also describes that the aircraft should be stored below decks to maximize space, and that freight elevators should be long enough and wide enough to receive planes with wings folded. The plans also detail that everything an aircraft needs should also be located below deck, including maintenance and workshops for easy access. And both ends of the runway should be clear so any aircraft that will landing or taking off can do so without interruption. However, at the time, aircraft were very simple and were not ready for the sort of operations and requirements put forward by these plans. The US Navy were the first ones to start trials and tests at the possibility of aircraft operating on the ocean. The first ship to launch aircraft was the USS Birmingham in 1910. The ship was retrofitted with a platform that was 83 feet long and 24 feet wide. Then on Monday the 14th of November, the Birmingham got into position with the Hudson Flyer built by the inventor Glenn Curtiss and its pilot Eli who worked for Curtiss at the time. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the pilot, Eli, signaled the mechanic to release the plane early. The plane began rolling down the ramp and disappeared off the edge, as Eli misjudged the height of the deck above the water. He, however, managed to pull back on the stick just in time for the plane to skim across the water and then ascend. The impact of the water damaged the blades of the propeller, but the props never stopped turning, and the control of the aircraft was unaffected. Even with the damage to his plane, Eli managed to land safely, 2.5 miles from where he took off. This was the first successful flight trial of an aircraft at sea, and it wouldn't be the last. The next big step was to land on a ship. The Navy retrofitted the platform to the USS Pennsylvania, like they did with the Birmingham, but this time, instead of taking off, the pilot would have to land. Eli flew from an aviation meet approximately 10 miles away from where he was meant to land on Pennsylvania. The captain decided to keep the ship anchored because there was not enough space to maneuver in the dockyard, as the ship was meant to be underway when the trials meant to begin. It was quite a big risk, but Eli decided to go ahead with the test as he came in from the rear with the wind to his back. As the plane approached, Eli pulled up to clear the stern of the ship and cut his engine. The tailwind and the momentum from the maneuver carried his plane over the first 11 resting lines, but the plane managed to catch and the hooks took hold with only 30 feet left and the plane came to a stop. This was the first real landing on the ship and was a major step forward for aircraft carriers. Now let's move away from boring old tests and let's actually move to implementations of the idea. Now this idea wasn't truly brought to life until the end of the First World War. However, there were early versions of them before this time. These are seaplane carriers, where a plane would launch from a ship and carry out its mission, then land on the ocean, and would be picked up later. The first real iteration of the seaplane carrier was La Foudre of the French Navy in 1911. As seen in this picture, La Foudre was equipped with seaplanes which were stored on the deck in a hangar. When needed, they would be readied and hoisted using the onboard cranes, which would lower the plane into the sea and the seaplane would carry out its mission. The whole process took around 20 minutes. The ship was later modified in November 1913 with a small runway to actually launch the planes off the deck. This saved on time because instead of waiting on the long and lengthy process of lowering a plane into the sea, it could launch directly off the ship and proceed directly on with its mission. The next and final seaplane carrier we will look at is the HMS Ark Royal. The first purpose-built seaplane carrier, it was laid down in 1913 and completed in 1914. It came with a complement of 8 floatplanes compared to La Foudre's 4 seaplanes. With double the air complement, it meant more aircraft could be sent on recon missions at a time and provide more intel to ground troops, helping them win key battles and skirmishes, and overall helping with the war effort. Now we have established the trials and attempts, we move on to the main show. The first ship we're going to talk about is the HMS Furious, the first true carrier Originally designed as a battlecruiser, she was later modified with a taking-off ramp in 1917. This ship was a hybrid. In the front, she was an aircraft carrier, and in the rear, she was a battlecruiser. With 18-inch guns, some of the most powerful caliber at the time, she was fitted with 4 seaplanes and 6-wheeled aircraft with a hydraulic lift connecting the runway and the hangar. Since the carrier only had a takeoff deck, the planes would not be able to land on board, so the only options were to make for a land airstrip or go down in the sea. This wouldn't be a problem for the seaplanes, however, for the wheeled aircraft it would be a massive risk. In 1918, Fusel's afterguns were removed in place for a landing ramp, with new hangars and hydraulic lifts also being installed. So now planes could actually take off and land from the same ship without having to be recovered or having to move to a land-based installation. However, there was still one major problem, and this was the central bridge, as hot gases from the boilers reduced the amount of air over the aft of the ship. So with a lack of air, it would be hard for planes to land, lose speed, and possibly crash into the ocean before they even reached the landing ramp. So for the third time, Furious went under reconstruction, starting in 1920 and finishing in 1925, with the entire central tower being removed and the whole top of the ship just being one long runway, making it a real aircraft carrier by modern standards. Next, we move on and look at the HMS Hermes, the first ship planned and designed to be an aircraft carrier. Work on the ship began in 1918 and launched in 1919. However, with the urgency of the war having passed, she wasn't fully completed until 1923. She had a similar appearance to HMS Eagle, but she had an improved design with a better top speed of 25 knots and a better aircraft carrying capacity of 25. With the war over, Hermes had an uninteresting service until the start of World War II. She was mainly used as a training vessel and a protection vessel for British interests all over the world. Moving away from Britain, we go over the pond to the US. The first carrier was the USS Langley. She wasn't a purpose-built carrier, instead being converted from an auxiliary ship. She had a large hangar with 2 3-ton cranes used to transfer aircraft onto the hydraulic lift to transport it onto the deck. This unusual setup caused the captain of the ship to develop new ways to keep serviceable aircraft on deck and lead directly to 2 improvements we use on carriers today, including barriers and catapult launching techniques. 2 further cranes were installed on either side of the ship so seaplanes could be lowered into the water from the hangar, and both hangar sides were also left open to help ventilate the hangar because of petrol fumes. The ship had a carrying capacity of 30 planes, but it could have more stowed away in its dismantled state. However, the ship was hampered by slow speed, so it could only launch first-generation aircraft and therefore wasn't used in combat, and was mainly used in research and testing. The next generation of American aircraft carriers led to the creation of the USS Saratoga and the USS Lexington. They were aircraft carriers converted from 33-ton battlecruiser hulls, keeping them under the tonnage of the Washington Naval Treaty. They had a carrying capacity of 90 aircraft and the design didn't change much from the Langley. Like the Langley, they had a forward hangar where dismantled aircraft were stored. However, where they did differ was the fact that the ships had bridges above the deck, allowing for more visibility and aircraft coordination. There were no seaplanes on board, setting a precedent for all US carrier designs to follow, as they wouldn't change much from this design, apart from the ships becoming heavier and larger, including new innovations. Moving away from the West, we head towards the Japanese, who in 1919 asked for assistance from the Royal Navy to help build a carrier. They decided to convert an oil tanker that was being constructed at the time and turned it into their first carrier, and in 1921 she was launched and completed in 1922. Named the Hosho, which translates to swooping dragon, she came in at about 10,000 tons and a capacity of 21 aircraft, which was smaller than the first attempts by the British and US. But she was much faster at 25 knots. She originally came with an island like the British designs, but however, because of the small width of the deck, it was quickly removed as it was deemed a hazard for incoming planes. Hosho's crew mainly saw her use as a prototype and training vessel. Although she did see some action during Midway, unlike the other IJN carriers, she managed to survive the war. The Japanese's next carrier was created from a surplus battlecruiser hull, like the British and the US's. This came after the Japanese abandoned the Washington Naval Treaty, therefore the ship was much heavier than the other ships at the time. 2 incomplete hulls, the Akagi and the Amagi, were selected but were damaged during an earthquake in 1923. Later in the year, work started to repair the hulls and construction on the carriers began, which were then completed in 1927. The design took after the Hosho's redesign and had no island. The main deck was 652 feet long, but it had 2 flying off decks. One was 60 feet long and was intended for fighters, and the other was 160 feet long, which was underneath the fighter deck and was for heavy aircraft. This design, however, didn't prove successful and was moved in a retrofit in 1936. The Akagi contained two hangars, one above the other, like British carriers, but they also took a note from the American designs and had a smaller hangar where dismantled planes were stored. During the 1936 retrofit, a further lift was added to give access to the extended hangar. The Akagi was used extensively throughout the war, but, however, she would meet her end at the Battle of Midway, when she was hit by dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. Now we've established the background and implementations of aircraft carriers for 3 different nations. Let's move on to their impact. To do this, we should go back to 1913. From the very beginning, a lot of nations took interest in aircraft, since the first flight by the Wright brothers, as they had always had an idea of using aircraft in warfare. Even in the early infancy, they saw the usefulness of aircraft and their future roles. This is why flight trials at sea happened so early on. Everyone wanted to see if it was even possible, and if it was practical. As we know, these trials were very successful, leading to the development of seaplane carriers, and then actual aircraft carriers later on. The impact of seaplane carriers was beneficial but minimal. The planes were only used for recon, they weren't really equipped with any armament, and therefore had no real role in any combat. In fact, ships in World War I didn't see much naval combat at all, as nations didn't want to send their precious fleets into combat. As time progressed, we see a shift away from big heavy ships to many different ships, each fitting a role in a fleet, with aircraft carriers being at the centre of them. This change can't all be credited to the aircraft carriers themselves, as the Washington Naval Treaty, which restricted tonnage of ships, played a big role. Therefore, nations could no longer build massive dreadnoughts and had to think about different classes of ships to play different roles. However, without the introduction of aircraft carriers, warfare would be quite different to the way it is right now, or the way it was back then. For example, aircraft carriers are treated as the centre of the fleet, the mobile operations centre, a place where operations could be launched and supported from. This would not be possible with any other class of ship, as they would not have the capability or equipment to fit this role. So major operations, like the invasion of the Japanese islands in 1944, would have never taken place, or at least over a long period of time, with a reduced capacity of troops, as carriers were the vessels that ferried necessary troops and equipment to the islands so they could capture them. Operations like this are nightmares to plan and manage with carriers, let alone without. So to be able to pull this off without carriers would require way too many ships to be practical for any fleet to pull off, as they would be susceptible to ground-based air attacks or even normal fleets, as they would be slow and easily spotted from miles away, causing the invasion to be able before it even started. When countries finally had working carriers, they made sure they were not wasted and immediately put them into roles that would use 100% of their ability. Firstly, looking at Britain, who were the pioneers of the aircraft carrier, being the ones to first develop a purpose-built carrier and being the ones who propelled the development of aircraft carriers forward. The British took the approach of having the carriers act as support vessels instead of having them as the centre of the fleet. They decided that it should act in assistance to the other ships in the fleet. For example, they could be used as an escort, and there were classes of carriers called escort carriers. Original, I know. This class is smaller than the mainline ships and perfect for escort duty. For convoys going to and from countries over the vast oceans, helping vulnerable convoys from submarines which saw the ships as juicy targets that were easy prey and had no escorts until late into the war. However, this doesn't mean they were restricted just to escort duties. They were used in many other roles throughout the war, like assisting assaults and operations, for example, D-Day and the Italian invasion. They were invaluable in dislodging embedded Axis ground troops and helping invading Allied ground forces, as they could provide air support and break the well-prepared defences set up by the Axis forces. Another memorable engagement carriers found themselves in was the hunt for the Bismarck, where the HMS Ark Royale launched swordfish torpedo bombers to hunt down the Bismarck and tried to sink her, but at very least incapacitate her. These were outdated bombers, but they worked perfectly against the Bismarck, and at the very end of the engagement, before the last planes had to turn back, they managed to hit the Bismarck's rudder, which damaged it enough to lock it into position so she could only turn in circles, leaving it vulnerable to the slower battleships and cruisers, allowing them to catch up and eventually sink the Bismarck. Without carriers, the Bismarck would have probably escaped into the Atlantic in order to disappear, so she could have wreaked havoc on supply ships and head to the Soviets. To conclude the British impact, Britain were the first ones to pioneer the aircraft carrier. They were the first ones to develop a purpose-built carrier. They were the ones who did the majority of the tests and took the majority of the risks. However, this does not mean they used them the most, as Britain had its carriers in a support role. They used them a lot during the war, but not as much as Americans, but more than the Japanese. They saw the value of what an aircraft carrier could be, and decided to monopolize on it on how they thought it would fit in their doctrines and their fleet tactics. The Americans went into World War II with pre-war tactics. In the pre-war, the Americans' doctrine focused on battle fleets. These are fleets built around battleships at the center, big, slow-moving, but heavy-hitting fleet, and this doctrine was in place for the first few years of the war. But they soon realised that if they were going to somehow win the war, they needed to change their plans, as battle fleets became less and less viable. By early 1943, new and effective methods became available, so the Americans decided it was time for a shake-up. They decided to form fast carrier task forces, fleets built around carriers themselves, with ships acting as escorts and defences, with the carriers of the task forces being the main hitting force of the fleet. The Americans realised that battles would no longer be fought up close and personal with battleships and big guns, but instead miles and miles away with planes. What makes the new doctrine more valuable and more viable is the fact that a carrier task force can engage multiple targets at once, so they can launch multiple squadrons to attack different targets, whereas a battle fleet is moving in one direction. It can only engage what's in its path. It can't go to the right and to the left at the same time to engage separate targets. And in World War II, this was more important than ever, because fleets no longer moved around as one big target, one big convoy. They were all separated all over the place and met up at one point to launch an operation. This was to help reduce the chances of being spotted and the chances of being destroyed. This can easily be proven by looking at the invasion of the Japanese islands, as the fleet that ferried troops and equipment to and from the islands were carrier task forces. They were able to quickly deliver a large quantity of troops and equipment to land a decisive blow against the defending Japanese troops. So let's conclude the American impact. The introduction of aircraft carriers allowed the Americans to adopt a new doctrine that helped them win the war, and it also helped them to see the flaws in their previous pre-war doctrines. It helped them see that the ships and their crew were not going into war with the proper training and indoctrination, limiting their overall effectiveness, and it showed them that they needed a new approach to how war was being carried out, which led them to develop the new carrier task force doctrines. So without aircraft carriers, these changes would probably never come about or would have never been as significant as they were, and it wouldn't have had a greater effect on how we wage war. Now, we might still have had battleship-centered fleets moving slowly across the world instead of carrier task forces that can move quickly and respond to a threat at a moment's notice. Finally, we will take a look at the Japanese. Now, the Japanese were in direct contrast to both the British and Americans. They decided well before World War II that they were going to focus on battleship-heavy fleets. This idea was brought on by their war with Russia, and going into World War II, despite being one of the first countries to actually develop aircraft carriers, they never saw the full potential of them, as before the war they accepted that they should stick with what they've done before and build battleships. So they ordered 4 new super battleships, and despite many being in opposition to this doctrine, the higher-ups in the Japanese Navy took no notice and never changed the doctrine. They saw carriers as an assistance to battleship, so they are mainly used in reconnaissance and spotting drills. And despite this, they still used carriers as the main attacking force for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now this is not because of a collective decision by the Naval High Command. No, this is because of one man, Admiral Yamamoto, who assumed command of the combined fleet in 1939, and he single-handedly changed their strategy from a passive defensive stance to a more aggressive stance. He was the one who decided carriers should play a bigger role in their strategies and actively facilitated this. But even with Yamamoto trying to change the doctrines, battleships actively played a major role in Japanese operations until late 1944. Japanese planners were making plans on how to defeat the US with battleships by using carriers and submarine forces to weaken the US fleets and lure them closer and closer to where battleships could outrange them and outgun the US fleets, and then decimate them. This shows how stuck in their ways they were with their doctrines. They didn't realize until the very last moment that aircraft carriers should have played a major part in the war. They always stuck with the idea that the battleship had big guns and can do big damage, so why go for something smaller? This leads to the fact that it was the war in the Pacific that led to the end of the Japanese Empire, and if they had a major focus on aircraft carriers, maybe they might have just been able to pull it off. To summarize the Japanese impacts, they were some of the people who pioneered aircraft carriers early on, but they never really discovered their full potential until it was late into the war. They were too focused on battleships and how big their guns were. So if they focused on carriers, or at least had carriers played more of a role in the war, then the outcome of the war may have changed in their favour. However, this is all hypothetical and we don't really know what the outcome would have been, now do we? And that ends the documentary. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned something new from this. And I apologise for how bad this will probably sound. Playing right now will be some credits and a list of my references. I will also link every reference in the description if you want to look at them yourself. Most of this was opinion based, so take away with a grain of salt. It's my opinion. So read the articles and draw your own conclusions from this. Again, thank you for listening, and have a good day.